Okay, we're going to start, folks. Folks outside, if you want to come in and join us. Great. Ooh, people get very attentive this morning. Thank you all for joining us today here for Stories to Watch 2020. I'm Michael Loco. I am the Global Communications Director here at WRI. As many of you know, we put on this presentation every year for the last 17 years, where we look ahead at the big events and moments that are going to shape the year to come. And of course, this year is a particularly important year as a lot of critical events are taking place. WRI is a global research organization. We have over 1,000 staff spread out across about 11 international offices now. So WRI has grown quite a bit over the last several years. Stories to Watch is our attempt to look at the trends, people, moments that are going to matter in the coming year. We don't predict the future, but we do try and make sense of it. So you'll hear more about that soon. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. Please follow along and use the hashtag STW2020. In addition, we'll have a Q&A session at the end. We look forward to your questions, and there are note cards. Some people may already have note cards. Emily and some others on my team can pass those around. Please fill out the note cards, try and write neatly, and we'll collect those at the end, and we can ask some questions of our experts. This is a joint, actually institution-wide event, so we draw on the expertise, and we have several of our experts here with us today. A lot of input from them. I also want to thank the great team that I work with, communications and the President's Office, who helped put this presentation together. Like many of you, I was very much looking forward to moving beyond 2019, sort of turning the page to the new calendar year. And now, of course, we have things like the president facing impeachment in the Senate. We have this terrible situation on Australia going on with wildfires. We're on the brink of war with Iran. So I've decided that I'm just going to go back to sleep and wake up in 2021 and just move on that way. But Andrew Steer, our president and CEO, has the challenging job of trying to make sense of this all, help us understand what the issues are, and maybe even leave us with a little bit of hope and inspiration for why we can make progress on our critical issues this year. Andrew doesn't need an introduction, but please welcome Andrew Steer, WRI's President and CEO. Thank you all.
Thank you, Michael, and welcome everybody. What a pleasure it is to. Am I reverberating? Sounds like it. Let me move this. Is that good? That's a little bit better. Welcome anyway. Thank you for coming. I hope this will be a conversation, although I will make a presentation. You are our partners. We're proud of what we do at WRI, but we realize that on our own we are scratching the surface. Our motto is count it, change it, scale it. In today's world, you've got to do the analysis. You've got to have some pilot successes. But we need scale. We can't do that. We can do it together with you. Can you all hear me? Yes. Good. So thank you for coming. Stories to Watch 2020. And as Michael says, we've done this for 17 years now. We do it in a rather unusual way. We get a team of some of our brightest, younger staff, and they spend sort of some of December and early January basically talking to all of our experts, identifying what matters. So we actually, there's an intergenerational thing going on here as well, which is very exciting. And we use this process each year to clarify our own thinking within WRI as to what we ought to be looking at. And so this is the result of some of that. And as Michael says, this is a more complicated one. It's very different from normal because 2020 is such an important year. And of course, it's a new decade. And it's worth reminding ourselves what the decade we just had was. Just think, for example, of Time Personalities of the Year. We started with great techno-optimism with a 25-year-old. We then had, do you remember the Arab Spring? We had President Obama, we had the new Pope, we had the war against Ebola, we had Angela Merkel at her summit, if you like. We then had Donald Trump, and then we have three sort of, if you like, efforts to fight things that were a real problem. The Me Too movement against harassment and sexual oppression. the guardians of the truth against the post-fact world, and of course, finally, Greta Thunberg, and we're going to talk a lot about this today. So an amazing decade, and as you reach the end of the decade, I mean, at one level, fantastic. In this country, lowest unemployment rate in 45 years. If you invested $1 in the stock exchange and you kept all your dividends, you'd now have $5 just 10 years later. Incredible. So it's been a great decade, right? Well, not really. In our space, well, yeah, if you've got a lot of money in the stock exchange, yes, great decade. Incredible sort of variety of natural disasters and unnatural disasters, if you like. We started, you remember, in 2010 with the oil spill. We then had Hurricane Sandy in 2012. We had just floods all over the world. I mean, truly tragic floods. This is India and Pakistan in 2014. We had air pollution, the like of which we've never seen before. 8 million people died of air pollution last year. More recently, India has become even a bigger problem. We had water was a massive issue in the decade. We had, remember, Day Zero in South Africa and so on. And then, of course, obviously, we had fires. So, basically, we had a lot of natural issues, more than any other decade, certainly in human memory. So that's sort of where we were. But in the middle of the decade, there was this wonderful sort of sense that maybe the era of global collective action could be back again. And we had, obviously, in 2015, we had both the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris deal. And for that brief moment, we thought, maybe, we're getting back on track. But actually, we didn't. And so if you read, I'm sure you did, over the weekend, with the new year, A Decade of Crisis and Anger, the decade that left us reeling, milestones of mistrust, our decade of guilt, a decade of uncertainty, a lost decade for climate, the decade of disillusionment. So good luck as we move forward into the coming decade. And so that's sort of what's been on our mind. So we're going to show, very briefly, 8 stories. But they're different from normal. First, 3 stories of issues where there will be big decisions made globally this year, we hope. And then, instead of looking at more stories, we're going to look at 5 different actors that will need to work together if we're going to make the progress we need to make. Because if you think about it, what went wrong last time, massive failure of collective action over the last decade, rising inequality, erosion of democratic norms, and a resurgence of nationalism, a sort of pretty bad cocktail that we've faced internationally. And we will focus mainly on the sort of the issues that require international action. So the 2020s, we say this every decade we enter into, it's a make or break decade. This time it's true. It really is true. I mean, and I'm not going to explain why it's true. I suspect you wouldn't be here if you didn't understand how important this decade is. But decisions made this year, 2010, because of the opportunities there are, the major international gatherings this year, they will affect in a pretty significant way, whether it's a make or a break decade. And 2 days ago, I posted a blog entitled Collective Action at the Crossroads. And that's really what it is. The problems we face cannot be solved by any individual actors or any individual countries. They require collective action, and we don't have it right now. So the overwhelming story of the year is not will 2020 be a turning point, but will it be a turning point for the better or for the worse? So first, part 1, the 3 big issues, and you could guess them: the ocean, biodiversity, and climate change. Why are these intersecting? Because if you talk to ocean experts and you say, how much of the ocean problem is due to climate change? They'll vary a lot in what they say, but a lot of them will say, well, between 50 and 70% of the problem. And actually, that makes the pollution issue and the waste issue and the overfishing issue worse. So too, each of these, if we solve the biodiversity problem, we would actually solve quite a bit of the problem of climate change, because we'd be protecting the forests and we'd be protecting natural. All of these are totally interrelated. And we will talk more about climate change in a way simply because that will have the biggest impact on those. But all 3 of them together matter a lot. So let me just, one by one, the opportunities this year. Everybody knows the problem of the ocean, I think. It's not only getting overheated, it's getting over-acidified. Remember, 30% of the carbon that goes up comes down into the ocean. So that's really bad. Everybody knows about over-pollution. More plastic than fish, you know, by 2050. You've heard that before. And of course, overfished. Dreadful overfishing. And this year, in the last year, we heard that it was actually worse than we thought. I'm sure you've heard the story of the IPCC teams that were writing this report. They actually had to have grief counselors at the end come in and support them because literally it was such an emotional thing for them to produce this, this report. There we are. And the targets that we set for ourselves in the sustainable goals that in 2015 for 2020 have not been met. So the SDG 14 is a little different from most because it had goals for 2020 as well. Here are the three. End illegal fishing. No, it's probably increased. End harmful fishing subsidies, $30 billion this year. Protect 10% of the ocean, not close, I'm afraid. Certainly not in terms of effective protection at all. So we're approaching it from a position of some failure. That's why the Ocean Summit, the second ever UN Ocean Summit, every nation of the world will gather in Lisbon in June. And the issue here is, yes, they will probably make 1,000 different declarations. The issue, though, is whether the politics and the psychology change at this meeting. Whether or not, for example, a new narrative emerges. There is a high-level panel on the ocean. 14 heads of state are overseeing that. We have the privilege of being the secretariat for that. It will issue a major report in June, which will try to change the narrative of the ocean, demonstrating that actually the way we're treating it is not only bad for the environment, it's dreadful for the economy, it's dreadful for society as well, and we actually have a better way. So look to see if the narrative starts shifting. Also, if that meeting is successful in Lisbon, there will be more chance under the WTO, which also meets in June, to address the problem of harmful fishing subsidies. I mentioned $30 billion, 85% of that goes to industrial fisher people, and overwhelmingly encourages overfishing and often illegal fishing as well. If we're successful also in that meeting in June to change the political complexion, we may have more of a chance on this very, very difficult issue. Today, 2/3, of the ocean is totally unregulated in any way. And so there is an effort to have a high seas agreement. The next negotiations start on March, and we hope by the end of this year there will be a deal. This is a very, very difficult and potentially very, very important issue. And finally, will the ocean appear, when we go to the climate negotiations, will the ocean appear more in countries' NDCs? We did, as part of the high-level panel, some work that shows that actually the right behavior in the ocean, and especially ocean industries, can address 1/5 of everything that needs to be done. So that's what we're looking for the ocean in this very, very important year. What are we looking for in biodiversity? I don't need to tell you that there is a serious problem. In the last year, we learned that over 1 million species are deeply threatened by the IPBES report. This next data is incredible. 60% fewer animals since 1960. I mean, striking, isn't it? And these are the Aichi targets, which 10 years ago in Aichi Prefecture in Japan, the world set itself targets for the coming decade. And there were 20 of them. And I won't tell you what they are, or we'd be here all day. Let me just say they haven't met them. We basically have failed. Let me give you one example. Target 5, halve the loss of natural habitats. Did we? No, it almost doubled during the decade. So we are not in good place with regard to this. That's why this meeting is exceedingly important, and the fact that China is hosting it is very important. This is a once in a 10-year meeting when we now have to, having failed with the Aichi targets largely, we now have to set new targets, and we have to set them in a way which actually gives more credibility that they will be met. And a lot of discussion going on. Many of you in this room are part of it. and organizations like WWF and IUCN and many others are heavily involved. There's a lot of thought about geography-based targets, protected areas, if you like, particularly important footprint-based targets. In other words, where are the pressures? Can we reduce those? And then the equitable sharing, which is the third part of the Biodiversity Convention. So by the time of the Biodiversity meeting in October, we need to know whether these are credible and whether there's an accountability framework to deliver them. So, for example, perhaps the most challenging one is the 30% protection both of land and of sea. This would be a big lift, huge discussions going on. Some of you are very involved in that. Finally, particularly because this is in China, the opportunity actually is much greater than it would be if it were in any other country, quite frankly. China would like this very much to be a successful conference. They're working extremely hard on it. The problem is that they know very well that actually, in many regards, their behavior with regard both to commodity trade, number one importer of soybean, beef, and timber, 58% of all the soybeans in the world are imported into China. Over half of the timber of the world is imported into China, tradable timber, that is. And so both in trade, but also in their so-called Belt and Road program, it's not necessarily at the moment particularly helpful for biodiversity, let's put it like that. So there's a lot of work going on right now. We're involved with the government of China in a really constructive way. I suspect some of you may be also, really to think through what would it take for China actually to put in place in its investment and in its trade mechanisms that could be more protective of the natural environment. So that's, if you like, the biodiversity, what we're looking for. Climate change, obviously, the big one, COP26, is in Glasgow, as you know. But first, you've seen this chart many times, the hottest decade on record. Yesterday, we got the data on 2019, second warmest year in recorded history. And of course, the reason is very clear, which is even in 2019, we are still rising at a time when we ought to be declining. And so the science is crystal clear, and the world is behaving the way scientists predict it would be behaving. In terms of where we are and what we need to do, this is the emissions now. These are gigatons of carbon equivalents. They include the non-carbon gases. This is where we are now. This is where we need to be in 2030, consistent with a 1.5 degree world. And if you look at the plans right now, this is where we will be. This is where we're heading under current NDCs. So this is not good at all. And just to remind everybody, this is where we need to be in 2050. So you get the arithmetic. It's pretty dire. And that's why this year is so important in terms of getting the kinds of decisions. So Glasgow, for the United Kingdom, in many ways their first big international diplomatic effort post-Brexit. So they're putting a lot of effort into this in a very good way. What do we need? We need long-term plans, which are a commitment that countries have to deliver under the Paris deal. So far, 72 countries have said that they will go carbon neutral, which is very good, net zero, by 2050, together with cities and businesses and investors. And then, of course, we need the short-term, the enhanced so-called NDC. This is obviously very important. One slight thing to watch is that it's a little easier, quite frankly, to announce we're going net zero in 2050 because a lot of us won't be here then. It's a little harder to say by 2030, this is what we're going to deliver. So watch for this. Watch for the link between those two. Special issues this year that need to have a lot of attention. One is nature-based solutions, rising very, very rapidly on the international agenda. Second, adaptation, the poor sister. The Global Commission on Adaptation is in its year of action in October. Major heads of state conference in Amsterdam will take place on adaptation. Ban Ki-moon, Bill Gates, Kristalina Georgieva are the co-chairs of that commission. We have the privilege of managing that together with the Dutch government. A third, finance ministers now coming into the fray much more than before. I'll say a word a little bit later about that. So these are three issues to watch particularly. So how would we know that Glasgow is a success? We would know because we can actually do the math. This is business as usual. This is under current commitments, roughly 3 degrees Celsius, be a disaster. We will know by the end of the year, based upon what commitments are, how far that comes down like that. And obviously we're not going to get down here, but we need to be sort of here by the end of the year. So we will be able to monitor that. That's what to watch. Okay, so those, if you like, are three big issues. And what I tried to lay out is what we need to see in each of those. The question is, who needs to do what? And so the remaining 5 stories are actually about actors, because they need to act together. Government, finance, business, technology, or innovators, and people, if you like. And this is what will form the collective action that is required. So that, as I said before, the stories to watch are a little different this year, because quite frankly, given how important it is, we couldn't pick individual stories. Like last year, do you remember we had a story on micro-mobility, that kind of thing, which is much easier to do. This is harder to do, so bear with me as we go through this. First, what do we want from governments? Who will lead? Unfortunately, the good old days where President Obama could do a deal with Xi Jinping, we don't have that anymore, which is a great shame. Don't count on us. The Saudis are going to be hosting the G20 this year. G20 should be the place where the countries come together. But unfortunately, G20 has been basically missing in action at the climate summit and beyond. So I don't think these two gentlemen shaking hands are going to lead us forward. Or the G7. And this is such a great picture because it sort of captures, sort of not everyone is looking in the same direction, or at least they're not. Maybe they're looking. This is going to be chaired by Donald Trump this year. So I don't think either G20 or G7 is going to deliver great things. So, but there are leaders out there. Incredibly, 79 countries have now announced that they will raise their ambition before Glasgow for a 10-year period. I mean, that is fantastic. And here they are. The only problem is they only account for 10.5% of emissions. These are relatively small. Some of them are significant, like Mexico, Argentina, South Africa. Interesting, none of the Europeans yet have been able to make commitments. Because they do it together, so to speak. They will, Norway up here. But mainly a lot of small islands, you can't see them here, and lower income, more vulnerable countries, they're saying they're going to become more ambitious. And some really emerging, Indonesia is not here, Indonesia is really rising through the ranks in terms of what it's doing. Colombia and countries like South Africa, really quite encouraging. So we do have leaders of the pack, but the real question as to what to watch is, will the big emitters stand up? The China's, US, EU, India. So they account for 50% of global emissions. So first, China. China slowing economically has made it, quite frankly, a little more difficult to make the kind of high ambition commitments that they made before. And so we now see this. 2 years ago, coal was declining in use in China. And China was overwhelmingly the biggest investor in renewables. It's still the biggest investor in renewables, but coal is rising again. And the reason for that is partly because the economy is slowing and they need to sort of take a path of somewhat less resistance. So too, Belt and Road Initiative, the moment not necessarily in the most helpful place, but they've set up a coalition for greening the Belt and Road, which we are heavily involved in, and some of you probably are too. Also, as I mentioned before, in their commodities. So there's a lot to watch for in China this year. Most important will be, will they come out at some stage during the year and say, we will raise our level of ambition as we go to Glasgow on climate change, just as we will as we host the Biodiversity COP. As you may know, they're committed at the moment to peak their emissions by 2030 of greenhouse gases. That will be too late for the world, quite frankly. And economically, they could do it considerably easy. We do a lot of analysis of that, and in China, some brilliant analysis in Tsinghua University and some of the research centers doing really interesting work as to what the economy of China might look like under different scenarios. So all to play for in China this year. The biggest, perhaps the biggest to watch. India, also very, very important. India is a remarkable country in not talking about climate change very much, but actually getting on and doing some things called by other names. So, for example, renewables. Prime Minister Modi went to the climate summit and announced even bigger commitments under renewables. Instead of going from 3 to 100 gigawatts of solar within 7 years, as he committed, they're now up to 350 gigawatts, I think, of renewables overall. Very, very impressive. Coal, they have, they have a sort of a balanced position. They have a moratorium on new coal-powered plants until 2027. But on the other hand, just yesterday, they liberalized the foreign investment law to allow foreigners to come in investing coal mining. So you can tell, just as in any country in the world, there's a heterogeneity within government as to what's going on. Electric vehicles, last year they said they were going to have a major program to move towards banning internal combustion engines, partly because of air pollution, and something might develop on that. That had to be pulled back, that commitment. So India, big country to watch. And the EU, obviously, most definitely as a leader. They've announced their Green Deal, which is a very, very encouraging, very impressive statement. But some real sort of questions. I mean, one would be Germany with the change in leadership there. It's just very difficult. They have commitments to phase out of coal only by 2037. Brexit, not so worried, quite frankly, about what the Brits will do, because they certainly want to deliver a very good COP26, but actually what the EU will look like in the absence of Britain, because Britain was actually quite an important anchor member, and some of the Eastern European countries may find themselves just with somewhat more votes, if you like, and so we might see some erosion. We hope not. And by the way, the new leadership in the European Commission and the European Union is very impressive. So we're hoping great things. And finally, just as Mr. Obama did a deal with China, there is a very, very important EU-China summit in October, I think. And we really need to see some sort of joint deal-making done. So that leaves the United States. I'm sure you have opinions just as informed as I do about the United States. This morning, so Mr. Trump is rolling back 95 different areas. We had a much more sophisticated slide, but I didn't want to discourage you too much. Like sort of all the different areas where there are the cutbacks. So just take it from me, it's 95. And today, this very day, he is expected to announce a rollback under the so-called NEPA relating to the Obama rules that if you invest in a major piece of infrastructure, you have to look at the greenhouse gas effect of that and the impact on climate change, both emissions and resilience, and that's going to be rolled back today. So not a good position. But on the other hand, as you all know, we're still in, is alive and well. 3,800 states, cities, business, and more, accounting for 68% of GDP of the United States. If these people and institutions who have committed to still be in the Paris deal, if they were a nation, they would be the second biggest economy in the world after the United States. So this is pretty serious. The World Resources Institute, we've worked with others here, the University of Maryland and the Rocky Mountain Institute, to ask the question, if this goes well, could the United States deliver what President Obama committed to deliver by 2025? And the answer is almost. If you saw real, with existing commitments, you wouldn't quite get there. With more subnational commitments, you actually could get there. They're quite encouraging, but that's not to say we don't need federal help and federal legislation. Obviously, we certainly do. Now, despite all of this, yesterday we got the day before we got the new numbers from Rhodium. Emissions in the United States, contrary to last year, emissions actually fell by 2%, and that's because coal declined by 18% in the last 12 months. So that's quite something, isn't it? So what to watch? Pretty obvious. This is not very insightful, but what will happen in the Democratic Party, not only who will win the primary, but what will the policy be as we move forward? That's going to be very interesting. Yesterday, as you know, the Democratic Party in Congress laid out its climate plans for this year, and pretty good. But not sort of wholehearted in terms of a carbon tax, for example, which is what actually is needed, or a carbon price at least. So this is obviously, there's a lot to go on here. I mean, it is interesting, and some of you in this room were part of this. I mean, 3 years ago, in the lead up to the 2016 election, organizations like ours and other environmental groups were being advised and requested by the White House and others to say, look, we really want to take climate change seriously, but don't be thrusting it into the election, because it's not an electoral winner right now. Now it is perceived, certainly within this party, of being an electoral winner, and that's really important, and not only climate change, but also obviously the entire green agenda and the blue agenda as well. Now, what happens on November the 3rd? Obviously, this is a pretty important week. And it's not just November the 3rd, the week is important. November the 4th, the day after Paris, the United States will formally leave the Paris deal. Now, we don't know who will be president-elect on the 4th, but that would be pretty interesting. And then the same week, just 6 days later, it's 5 days later, the COP will start in Glasgow. The question is, who will go to the COP? This will be a very interesting week in the politics and history of climate change. So a lot to look for. So that was government, if you like. Second sort of actor is the financial markets. I put this here because this is a very, very important year for finance. And it's not just finance, will countries put the 100 billion in for climate. It's something much richer than that. It's not the billions, it's actually the trillions. And we're seeing, you can read these, you've read on the one hand, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, many others making large commitments for this. Bank of England, stress test, green bonds growing, shareholders. So you see the financial markets are starting to get engaged in this. A central bank are the world's newest climate change activists. These are all headlines. And so too, even the big investors, BlackRock is estimated to have lost foregone profits, doesn't mean they actually lost the money, foregone profits by staying too heavily in fossil fuels. $90 billion, a lot of money. And so too, we're seeing the sort of physical risks have arrived. You've all seen PG&E in California, for example. But obviously, insurance companies are now getting very, very engaged in the issue if $650 billion in the last 3 years have been the economic costs. So you can tell the direction of travel here. And more heavyweights, this is the biggest fund in the world, over $1 trillion, the Norwegian oil or pension fund, as they call it. Insurance companies, these are all getting out of fossil fuels altogether. The European Investment Bank just last month made a very, very important decision here, and a politically very brave decision, and even some banks now are getting into that situation. So you notice that these tend to be European or Asian. We don't yet see this kind of engagement with US major institutions. So too, these are sustainable investment funds. Those are funds that if you've got some money and you want to put it in a fund that will invest only in greener investments, this just in the last year, a threefold increase. And now it's still not a very high level, quite frankly, but the direction of travel, again, is very clear. And there are loads of initiatives out there, and quite frankly, it's quite complicated. So whether you're an asset manager, Climate Action 100, to work with 100 major global companies and insist, if you want our money, if you want us to buy your bonds or your shares, you will behave in a certain way. So to a whole bunch of these here, new coalition of finance ministers, these are central bankers. All of these have been created, just in really many of them in the last few years. This is a bit longer, but in the last few years. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, perhaps by far now the most credible organization to lay out sort of rules of disclosure. This, again, is all part of the direction of travel, but look, we're not where we need to be. This is work that our finance group, Leo is over there, did. It basically asks the question, so a lot of you are making a lot of commitments to invest in sustainable investment, and that's this vertical axis. But a lot of you also are still working with fossil fuel companies, and this is what you're investing in fossil fuel. And you see that the size of the financial institution is the size of the circle. So, for example, JP Morgan Chase is doing a lot more with fossil fuels than it is doing on the green side. Wells Fargo, Bank of America doing some terrific things, by the way. I mean, $350 billion they've committed, but they still are doing less than they're doing with fossil fuels. There's Barclays, and then you've got some of the Europeans that are more over here. So there's a long way to go, quite frankly. So what to watch? What to watch? When you've got Christine Lagarde, head of the EIB, and you've got Kristalina Georgieva, head of the IMF. We've never had this before. I mean, two women totally committed to address problems relating to nature and climate change and biodiversity. So the question is, will financial regulators push for more green, less brown? All kinds of interesting things being discussed right now on risk weighting, on disclosure, on stress testing. Bank of England has already said we are going to do stress testing on climate-related risks. We're going to insist on that. So this is a year, watch this, because this is really important. World Development Banks, I hope there's someone here from IDB or World Bank, but we work very closely with both of you, and we love the direction that you're moving in. Will development banks truly be able to say they're aligned with the Paris deal? There is a fundamental shift going on at the moment between doing better. Everyone's doing better. I'm emitting less, or I'm doing this. There's a big difference between doing better and doing enough. And doing enough means we can say, with a clear conscience and a straight face, that actually what we're doing is consistently moving towards a 1.5 degree world. And that's quite difficult analytically, quite frankly. And the development bank's doing really interesting work on this, by the way. So they're working on this. And so this is not a criticism, but this year is when they need to come out and say, this is how we're going to demonstrate that we truly are moving the ball down the field towards a no more than 1.5 degree world. So that's the second one. What to watch? This is a very important new development. 55 finance ministers, including some very big ones, have signed up to the new coalition for finance ministers on climate. This is a picture of them. The World Bank as a secretariat, doing a very, very interesting job. They have 5 working groups. One's on carbon pricing, one's on fiscal policy. Really, really interesting. One's on disclosure. The hope is that these guys and more will become a coalition that actually helps lead towards success in the NDCs. Will they actually, instead of the moment, most finance ministers look, say, to the Minister of Environment comes and says, our plans are this, and they say, are you crazy? We couldn't afford that. Instead, entering the 21st century economics, which basically shows that moving towards low carbon in a smart way and resilient future will lead to a better economy, actually more revenue as well. So finance ministers are starting to get this in a big way. The question is, will they have a voice in the lead up to Paris? And the final question to watch is will all of these complicated initiatives that have lots of sort of spaghetti-like, acronyms, will it start becoming intuitive, and will they start adding up so that the financial markets as a whole are perceived to be agents of good and solutions rather than agents of bad, where sadly, simply because traditionally financial markets are short-term in focus and they're conservative. That tends to make them want to do what they've always been doing. They have short-term returns. And so traditionally, even though they like to say they're neutral, actually they've been fairly negative. They could now be a force of incredible good. There is no one in the world better equipped to be appointed as the Secretary General's new climate change envoy and on finance as well. Then Mark Carney, who's been governor of the Bank of England and has led this more than almost anybody else. So, I mean, he really has the bit between his teeth, and we certainly want to support him. Our board chair, our co-board chair, David Blood, who runs Generation Capital, works very closely with Mark Carney, and I think we're all really hoping to support him as much as we can. So that's the financial market. Then the business sector. What do we need from the business sector, and what hope should we have? Next week is 10 days from now, Davos, the World Economic Forum starts. It's the 50th anniversary of the Davos meeting. The theme is shared value and shareholder or stakeholder, from shareholders to stakeholders, if you like. And so, you know, this is a pretty important thing as companies, in order to earn the legitimacy to keep operating in this complicated world, they are rebranding and actually substantively starting in a modest way to rethink what their purpose is, not just to support their owners. This is a very big issue, much more difficult for the United States because of various legal issues, but still very, very important. Remarkably, we now have more than 750 major companies that have signed up to science-based targets, which is an incredible thing, adding to 4 gigatons. That means a commitment to decarbonize throughout our entire supply chain over the coming 30 years. Really remarkable. And this 4 gigatons is like 7% of total global emissions. So this is pretty important. And obviously, we're seeing lots of new technologies, new approaches, circular economy, 4.5 trillion opportunities. But we're still seeing, quite frankly, I mean, we are all consumers, and the world's growing very rapidly in many places. Consumerism is rising. And so I'm sure you've seen sort of each year they specify a date when we've used up all the resources in the world that can't be renewed. And that usually is sort of July, and it's getting earlier each year. And so, you know, this is, if you like, a sort of tidal wave of good things, good that consumption rises, a tidal wave that needs to be addressed. And look, we're not doing well on commitments that were made on forests. So major importers, traders, you know, the manufacturers using commodities made commitments that by 2020 they'd be deforestation free. That has turned out to be much harder than was anticipated. This is sort of the size of Denmark, has been lost every year. So what to watch? Back to science-based targets. Science-based targets is something that WWF, WRI, CDP, and UN Global Compact, together with We Mean Business, work on together. And the deal is, you can commit to decarbonize. We will sort of help you think through whether or not that is adequate. We will endorse or not endorse your plans. And then every year you have to be transparent on what you're doing. No one's forcing them to do it. It's all voluntary. I mentioned before that we're 750. This year we need that to go up to 1,000. And equally important, and by the way, you heard at the climate summit that all these companies are now committing to 1.5 degrees. That's all part of this. So originally when we set it up 4 years ago, the deal was you had to commit to be consistent with a 2-degree world. Now it's a 1.5 degree world. So this is tough. And it's because they perceive this to be in their long-term interest. But equally important as the number is the sectors. We've done some work on this, and our view is that if you can get to 20% of the major companies in a sector, you can start getting something dynamic happening, and ideally you get into that positive loop. These are areas, these are sectors where already we have 20%. These are ones that we don't, and this is where we need to work this year, and these are obviously harder, quite frankly. So that's what we're watching this year, is this percentage growing, we hope. Third thing to watch for companies is extremely important in terms of both the Biodiversity Convention and the ocean meeting, which is, as we've now sort of methodologically figured out what science-based targets mean for greenhouse gas emissions, we need to do the same now for other aspects, for water, for land, for biodiversity, for the ocean. So there is a major initiative going on at the moment called the Global Commons Initiative. and it's starting to receive a lot of funding. It's a multi-partner group, if anybody wants to know more about it. And it's basically going to try and do for oceans, biodiversity, water, and land and forest what we've done for science-based targets. And we're a member of this, and some of you certainly are here, if anyone here from CI or WWF or TNC. We're all in this together. It's a very, very good partnership. Watch by the end of, by the way, and this will be discussed in great detail at Davos 2 weeks from now. Watch this space in the lead up to these big meetings. And finally, a very, very important issue is we now have lots of leading companies doing and saying the right thing, but their trade associations generally have not been doing that at all. Trade associations, lowest common denominator. We're now seeing very good change in the International Chambers of Commerce, for example. Paul Pullman is now the chair of that, as you may know. A Business Roundtable, as you know, in the United States, that's the CEO group of very large companies. Interestingly, Walmart is taking over as the chair of that. And Walmart's really, very much into this space. So watch this space. Could be really, really interesting. US Chamber of Commerce, quite frankly, needs to move. Some of its leading members are saying to it, look, guys, you're still last century. You're still opposing everything that actually would help us become more vibrant and move into a much more competitive situation. We expect there to be changes, quite frankly, in the coming year. We're already starting to see some small ones. We don't expect it to become the Sierra Club, overnight, but we do expect some change. Watch that space, and one can monitor that pretty clearly in terms of all their testifying on Capitol Hill and so on. So that was business, what to watch for. We're nearly through now, by the way. You'll be glad to know. Technology is the next one. Technology is a difficult one. There are two schools of thought always. There are those that say we have loads of technology and actually we just need to implement it. And there are others, like Bill Gates, who would say unless we have truly breakthrough technologies, we're not going to manage. So we spend quite a bit of time thinking about this, and I'm sure you do too. I mean, a simple point to start with. Once you develop technologies, they take off much quicker than you expect. This was electric power. This is 1900. This is 2020. These are refrigerators. Literally in one decade, you create an entire market. That's automobiles, a little bit longer. Color TVs. Anyone old? I remember this. Absolutely amazing. And then look at internet. Literally 15 years, you go from zero to 98%, 95% or whatever. So don't believe anybody if they say, oh, it's going to take forever. We only have 3% renewables at the moment. It's going to take. No, that's not the case. Once you get it, you can move very quickly if it's attractive. And by the way, it's not just hardware. It's software. Impossible Burger yesterday announced that it would love to help McDonald's because McDonald's had asked it, but it simply couldn't produce enough of the stuff. Gone from 0 restaurants in 2016 to 15,000 restaurants. Remarkable. And I'm not saying we've won the battle on beef, by the way, at all for the moment. And I'm not telling you all to become vegans, but you can change things pretty quickly. So just a few things to watch. We could look at loads of things here. One is, everyone talks about heavy vehicles, trucks, buses, very difficult, very expensive. Actually, not true anymore. China has 96% of all of the electric buses in the world today. They're doing great, and they're making a market out of it. They're going to sell it like crazy. Latin America says we want to be the next China here. Really exciting things going on in Colombia and in Chile. And so too, you've seen this announcement on Amazon, 100,000 electric trucks. This will drive down prices quite a bit. Ford's electric F-150, best-selling vehicle in the United States, coming out in an electric version. Fantastic. Watch this space, because this will flip some psychology if this goes forward. So that was the easy one. Battery storage, still the prices are falling, but not fast enough. This week that Tesla launched its new mega factory in China. That will drive down costs very substantially. In terms of the grid-based, expected in 2020 to triple in the United States, but of course from a from a very low level. This is perhaps the most exciting thing to look at right now. For the last 20 years, we've sort of said, yes, we can get the electricity generation done with renewables, but there's a whole bunch of hard-to-abate sectors that are going to be impossible. Steel, cement, airlines, heavy transport, major ocean shipping. Incredibly important work done over the last year on the Energy Transitions Commission, which we're part of, to show that actually for 0.5% of global GDP, you could totally decarbonize these so-called hard-to-abate sectors by 2050. And really interesting work going on in China, believe it or not, on this very issue. And so next 2 weeks from now in Davos, there's major meetings on decarbonizing steel, on decarbonizing cement, on ocean shipping. Maersk has announced, as the biggest container, Western container fleet in the world, that it's going to totally decarbonize. Doesn't know exactly how, but it's got some very good ideas and it will do it. So this is something to watch. And then the next frontier, the kind of what I mentioned, we need new technologies. No question that this would be incredibly helpful. And 2020 is a very important one. The world's largest direct air capture plant. At the moment, very expensive to take carbon out of the air. But like everything else, the price will come down, and at some stage, it will make real sense. This company, Heliogen, I think you probably know, they just last month announced that they could generate a temperature of 1,000 degrees Celsius. Why does that matter? From reflecting solar thermal. Why does that matter? Because at that temperature, you can address those hard-to-abate. You can address the cements, the steels, and so on. So that's really important. Electric aircraft testing, I mean, yes, it's a bit of a way off, and the first zero-emission gas plant moves towards full-scale development. You could list a lot more. I mean, the whole hydrogen economy, a lot of money is going to be going into this. Even in the United States Congress, there's discussion about ramping up some support. So that's the next frontier. So finally, perhaps the most important actor of all, having mentioned the sort of the financial markets and business, are the people. And that's what gives us great hope. I don't want to ask if anyone in this room was at this meeting, which was the first Earth Day 50 years ago this year, on April, whatever it was, the 6th, April the 22nd. People power does matter. Within just a few months, the Clean Air Act was passed, creation of EPA. Our very good friend and the friend of many people here, Bill Ruckelshaus, first head of EPA, died last November. He was board chair of WRI as well. And that led then to Clean Water Act, led to the Endangered Species Act, all during the Republican administration of Richard Nixon. So people power does matter, and we're now seeing it like we have not seen it since the 1970s, and perhaps even more so now. And you've seen growing social movements, not just in the West, if you like, but also increasingly in Latin America and in Asia as well. And obviously the young people, in 1 week, 7.6 million people marched, led by a 16-year-old Swedish young woman in 185 countries. We haven't had that before. And the question is, will it make the difference? And it's not just young people, it's indigenous people. I mean, we tend to think in the West that we can enjoy protesting whatever we like. Actually, where it really matters in terms of biodiversity and that, it's actually 4 environmental defenders are killed every single week. And indigenous people, are simply not being allowed to manage their land. And yet research that we've done here together with the Rights and Resources Institute shows that indigenous managed land will protect the forest dramatically more than other property rights. Trades unions are now very much getting into this space in a big way, partly because simply the data now show that it's actually good for employment to move forward with a very pro-environmental agenda. But it's a time of great social stress. I mean, there's a lot of politics here. You've seen France and Chile and Ecuador. And in some ways, one of the reasons that the Earth Day was so successful is actually, it wasn't just an environmental movement. It actually had all of the energy from the anti-war protests as well. In some ways, this is also being empowered by, for example, you know, the great unfairness of the whole thing. I mean, the top 10% create more than half of all the greenhouse gas emissions. And yet, who are the greenhouse gas emissions hurting overwhelmingly? It's the bottom 50%. It's those that, and this is a great picture of Mumbai, part of a wonderful series of pictures of unequal juxtapositions of poor and less poor together. I wouldn't call those rich, but certainly poor and unpoor. So a lot of politics in a very healthy way could come into this, but on the other hand, it could confuse things. So watch for this. So 4 issues to watch. First, you know, will civil space, which is shrinking in many countries, will civil space that enables these kind of people movements, will it be protected? And most dramatically, you know, we mentioned in Latin America, the Escazu Agreement, you may not have heard of it, it's actually very, very important. It's about environmental rights of everybody to know what's going to happen, have access to data, and we need 5 more countries to sign this year in order for it to come into force. And then we need to see it to go to Africa and Asia. This is a very, very important. So this is a Peruvian woman, a Honduran woman who was one of the people that was murdered for protesting. This is her daughter. So number 1, will civic space be protected? Number 2, will the theme of a just transition really rise to the fore in the lead up to COP26? This matters a lot, because if it doesn't, then you're going to lose some of those that really are believing this, including trades unions and so on. So that's question number 2. And very exciting work being done on what a just transition should look like. Question number 3, all very well to have all these protests, but will governments actually respond? I suspect several of us in this room were in the Madrid climate meetings. Wonderful to see incredible student and youth engagement there. But at the end of the day, they were thrown out of the convention center. And quite frankly, they didn't have any impact really to speak about in a serious way on the negotiations. We need to see that changed. Now, we are seeing it at the national level. I mean, there now are, I think, 15 countries in the world that have declared what are called climate emergencies. The UK, under a Conservative government, declared a climate emergency. Why? Because Extinction Rebellion was irresistible in a good way. And they didn't only declare a climate emergency, they actually put in place legislation that was really good to implement it. So the question is, it is noticeable that still most of these have been in the West, but growing. Now, Argentina, Bangladesh, and so on, we could start seeing it. So this is, by the way, the European Parliament actually voting on the 2020 budget, which includes a lot of resources for environmental issues. And then finally, will activism lead to political change? At the end of the day, politics need to change. Elections need to change as a result of these initiatives. So those are 4 questions. So if you like, 3 big issues this year, 5 key actors. And I just want to close by sort of making the point that when we think of collective action, which we need for collective global problems, we tend to think of countries need to work together. But actually, we need different sectors to work together. And so what we really need is what we like to call an ambition loop, which governments won't act nowadays unless they feel legitimate support from their corporates, for example. They will listen to citizens. Citizens must influence government, must influence business and finance. And it's only when you start getting this, I mean, we didn't want to make it too messy. Actually, these should be going all over the place. And that's what an ambition loop is. We've done quite a bit of work on what is it that causes a tipping point, a positive tipping point. And one of the things is this. You need the problem that's so clearly stated. You need solutions that work. You need the politicians demonstrating it's good for them, the business people, good for them, citizens, good for them, and you need them to come together to ramp up their level of ambition together. That's what we need for this year and for this decade. Is what we did not have in the last decade at all. And worth remembering just, so 1962, Silent Spring, took 10 years for DDT to be banned, 1972. But because of this, and because of the Cuyahoga Canal being on fire, because of that, and by the way, that's the Cuyahoga today. So we've made progress there. Because of that, we were able to have, millions at the original Earth Day, and because of that, you have even a man like this who didn't wake up each Monday morning thinking about the environment. This is Richard Nixon, by the way, and his wife Pat, planting trees in the White House in honor of the progress. So don't give up hope. We're going to work extremely hard this coming year, and would very much like your comments, your rebuttals, and anything you'd like to say right now. So these are the 3 sort of issue stories. These are the 5 actors, so to speak. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everyone. Note cards are being passed around. Andrew will probably call on some folks too with questions. Please make sure you ask a question. Please identify who you are. We'll take some who want to raise your hands, but if you want to just write questions on a piece of paper, we have folks collecting, and we will be having microphones around too. So back to you, Andrew, for the Q&A. Thank you.
Good. Take the front row.
Yes, sir. Mark Carney seems to be one of your heroes and should be. You're going to move. What's the potential, and what do you see that movement? Because he has no power. It's all influence.
But please identify who you are and use the microphone if you can. Thanks.
Tim Forsman from Earth Party. Thank you.
Good. Yeah. I mean, look, he has a great reputation. I mean, he's just one player, but I mean, we had a very good envoy in Michael Bloomberg before, and now we're going to have somebody that is going to have more time, I think, to engage, particularly in some of these finance issues. So when you say, I mean, there are certain people that become sort of national statespersons. He knows, every finance minister, every governor, and so yeah, it could be really good. Yes, yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Got a mic for you right here.
Adam Siegel, Insight Tier Analysis. When you reference 0.5% as cost to decarbonize, isn't it really an investment with much greater returns? So is cost the wrong framing of the discussion?
Thank you, Adam. It's like we asked you to ask that question. Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I was, of course, there's been incredible intellectual revolution over the last 10 years, and some of you have been writing about this, basically going from, well, I would like to do something about climate change and biodiversity prevention, but it's going to cost me in terms of jobs, and it's going to cost me in terms of economic growth and so on, to now we recognize that actually smart climate action leads to greater efficiency, new technologies, addressing issues like air pollution, and long-term stability of policies, which combined lead to a more vibrant economy. I think some of these hard-to-abate sectors, I mean, it is going to be, they are going to feel it's more of a cost in the first instance, but your point is dead right. Yes?
Thanks, Sandra Bear with Personal Cities. It seems like you mentioned new solutions, and I'm just curious if there's a movement to figure out completely new solutions. In other words, are we asking the harder questions? Are we peeling that onion so that a different kind of transformation might shape our future? It seems like what's happening is not, you talked about so much good and bad that's going on, but it seems like there's so much that's same old, same old. Muscle memory exists in all of us. Can we let go of that to find maybe solutions that have never been discovered before?
I think that's a very good reminder. I mean, yes, the way we think about it is, I think, the same way you think about it. We need We need real revolutions, real disruption in at least 5 major areas of economic and social life. Our cities need to look totally different. They need to be designed for people, not for automobiles. And we know what that looks like. You've done work on that. Our food systems, Paul Pullman and people like that say our food systems are failing. We need radical change in the way we do our food system. We need different manufacturing from take, make, waste to circular economy. We obviously need radically different energy systems, but we also need different consumption as well. And that's where being part of the circular economy, that's why, food loss and waste, and all those things like that. Yeah, so we need that. And we probably should say that more directly. I think that's true. Now, if you really believe that, then you are going to have some pretty out-of-the-box thinking. Yes, so I get your point very much.
Andrew, we have a lot. You must have done a good job today. We have a lot of questions coming in. So if you want me to hand out some index cards, let me know.
Yeah.
Great.
So why don't you read
great.
one?
I'm going to read one.
We'll
I'm going to Chip to answer this one.
Yeah.
How important is the IUCN World Conservation Congress in Marseille in June? Maybe an event that we didn't include on our list.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Andrew. I'm Chip Barber here at World Resources Institute, the senior resident tree hugger who deals with things like IUCN and biodiversity. The IUCN World Conservation Congress happens every 4 years. It's a big gathering. IUCN, as most of you know, is a unique organization that has members who are agencies of governments and non-governmental organizations, thousands of them. It's kind of a trial run and a place to talk about a lot of these issues, I think, which is a bit less formal than what happens, say, in the biodiversity meeting and the climate meeting. This year it's in France. I know the French government's taking it very seriously. We're going to be quite involved in some issues there. It's an important place. It's not a decision-making body in the same way, but it's a place to test out ideas, bring people together. One thing that we're involved in there is looking at issues of conservation crime and corruption and it's got quite a set of people involved in organizing those sessions, the World Bank, USAID, State Department, WWF, and others. So yeah, it's important. It's not going to change the world in itself, but it's a place where you can float ideas, push things forward, build coalitions, and do a lot of what Andrew was talking about to pull together all these technology and civil society and others. So yeah, I think it'll be important, and I think the French government is really trying to make a stand there on a lot of these issues in advance of what will happen in the fall.
Yeah, well said.
Should we do one more index card? I'm going to ask Craig Hansen, the head of our several of our large programs here, to answer the question: how does WRI think the fishing industry can both meet sustainability goals mentioned today and meet WRI's sustainable food future goals?
Great. Andrew's first area was about the oceans, and the fishing industry is fundamental to the health of the oceans going forward. We have a world where basically we need more protein for growing populations, especially people that live close to the coast. Fishing industry is really important. At the same time, we need to reduce the environmental impact of the fishing industry. A couple things. One is our views are that it needs to be reforms to the fishing industry in terms of the catch and to actually get to more sustainable catch sizes. Secondly, growth in terms of aquaculture and more sustainable aquaculture, including things like algae-based fish feeds to relieve pressure on we shouldn't be feeding fish to feed even bigger fish, right? Which is a big impact in terms of species in the oceans. To get more on this, actually, this same time next week here at WRI, we're actually having the release of 2 new blue papers as part of this high-level panel for sustainable ocean economy, answering actually that very same question. So if you're interested, please find us afterwards. Go on to WRI's website and register for questions about how we're going to feed the future through the ocean and the impact of climate change on the ocean, right here, same time next week. Thank you.
Great. Andrew, do you want to take one more from the audience, and then we'll come back to some folks
over here.
Hi, thanks. That was terrific. My name is Holly Krambeck. I'm with the World Bank. It does reverberate. My question is about data. Better data would help us tell better stories, help decision makers make more informed decisions to solve these problems, and also help us better measure our progress on achieving outcomes. I was wondering, how do you see WRI's role in getting better data in the hands of these 5 stakeholders that we talked about?
Oh, That's a wonderful question. Thank you. I wonder if we could pick one sector, the finance sector, Julia, in terms of how do we, I mean, because you're the World Bank, but you're doing great stuff there. Well, how can we and others help move from what's been up to now good, but somewhat amateur almost, in terms of how financial markets sort of think about the environment? I hope I'm not putting you on the spot. Julia is one of our leading finance people.
Hi, everyone. I'm Julia Christensen. I lead our Sustainable Investing Initiative. So data has been a really important topic for driving better investments that's more climate friendly. And I think the TCFD that Andrew mentioned has been a key initiative. The hope is that if companies and investors themselves will disclose more about their climate-related investment risks and opportunities, that knowledge will then drive investment towards climate-friendly solutions that we need. Unfortunately, the TCFD guidance came out over 2 years ago, and we're not seeing the disclosures that would help drive that better decision-making. We're hoping that this year we will see clearer disclosures, particularly around physical risks from climate change, as companies and investors become more aware of what the impacts of climate change are. And then also really realizing the potential losses, for instance, from continued investment in fossil fuels that just aren't going to perform the way they have. So something to watch. We're seeing a lot of the data agencies like MSCI and others are really looking at this issue. Moody's, S&P, they're all buying up firms that have this information. And I think we'll start to see risk getting priced more accurately as a result of better data.
Good, thank you. I'd love to have a separate conversation on this, by the way. We're building something called Resource Watch, which starts on some of the databases we already had, like Global Forest Watch and Aqueduct and so on. And essentially, together with many partners, I mean, it's not just us by any means, essentially think about sort of 200 GIS-linked databases that you can overlay very easily. So we can now, very easily overlay water risk moving forward over shale gas deposits to see whether or not it would make sense, kind of thing. So, and you guys do a lot of that. So we ought to develop a deeper partnership. Let's take some more, Michael. Okay.
Wait, sorry.
My name is David Baxter. I represent the International Resilience and Sustainable Center, which is affiliated with the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe.
Great.
We are very focused on advancing the idea of people-first public-private partnerships, and I think that ties into your story number 8. Most governments have national strategies for developing infrastructure. They're doing it increasingly through public-private partnerships, but they are national strategies, not necessarily people-focused, and so their citizens are often left behind. And in many countries which are not true democracies, these are vanity projects that are just decided. Any thoughts from the WRI in this aspect?
Yes. Well, how about to Kevin?
Hi, Kevin Moss. I run our program for business sustainability. And Andrew pointed actually at me because we also run P4G, the Partnership for Green Growth and the Global Goals, which is all focused on public-private partnerships. But I think your question is a broader question than that, which is about the people focus. And I think we all in our community recognize that over the last few years, we've put a lot of effort into working on the environment and on environmental issues, but we haven't got the people part of this right. We don't necessarily see that there are losers, and we can't, I think in the past we've tended to overlook that in the interest of the bigger picture, but not pay enough attention to the fact there are going to be some losers, and we do need to take account of the impact on them. So I think the bigger answer to the question, if I take it broader than just public-private partnerships, is people across all of these issues and stories need to be a bigger focus of attention for us in the coming decades to avoid some of the pushback that we've seen from civil society.
Andrew, want me?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So I have a good hard question. So I'm going to ask Janet Ranganathan, our Vice President of Science and Research, to answer this one, which is a theme that came up throughout the presentation and one that we've actually been struggling with a bit, which the question is, there is a systemic problem of goal setting with no follow-up. Is accountability or penalties a viable and effective solution? So Janet Ranganathan.
Yep, great question. And it actually relates back to the question that Holly asked, I think, about how is WRI harnessing the data revolution to support our mission. And one of the good news is that actually it is easy for us now to monitor what's happening in the planet in real time at high resolution and high spatial resolution too. So we do actually have the engine that can actually hold corporations increasingly accountable for those commitments they make, and we need to use that. We also have the information to hold governments accountable for the health of their nations and what they're doing about it. So the questions that Andrew's asked today about, are people going to rise up and ask and hold their governments accountable? Are companies going to actually make good on those 750 science-based target commitments? We have the engine to actually support that. So I have a lot of hope there. I hope the transparency and accountability that plays out through the elections, through what customers choose to buy, where people choose to invest, will be a powerful force for good. Thanks.
Andrew, got to do one more.
Janet, I apologize. I hadn't seen you there. Janet runs all of our data and oversees our data work. So I'm sorry. She should have answered the earlier question.
Andrew, I have also two quick questions,
Okay.
but we can go. Do you want to do that? You want me to? I'm going to ask David Waskow to answer two questions briefly. We're sort of running a little short on time here. The first question, these are somewhat related, is what is the practicality of declaring a climate emergency? Is it more than just words? And another climate question that I think is on people's minds is, according to multiple reports, we are not on track to achieve 2 degrees or below 2 degrees, and that's the true statement. I think it's right now we're not on track. Is it useful to discuss expectations rather than aspirations? So 2 questions.
Great. Thank you. So on climate emergency, for sure, those are merely words that don't do anything on their own unless they're followed up by action in some way. I think we have seen that they can be an important foundation for action. In the UK last year in May, the Parliament passed legislation essentially saying that there was a climate emergency, and then a month later adopted policy for net zero emissions by 2050. So I think it laid the groundwork politically for taking that strong action. In some countries, the United States, perhaps in particular, there are questions about whether the adopting climate emergency would have legal consequences in terms of what an administration might do. I won't get into those legal nuances here, but it is important to note that it might in some contexts actually have legal effect. In terms of 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees and where we're headed, I think it's absolutely critical not to understate the challenge. Certainly, as Andrew said, we have a critical decade ahead, and how quickly and aggressively we address climate in the next decade will determine whether we're able to reach those goals. I think one important thing to keep in mind is we know from the IPCC report that 2 degrees is a lot worse than 1.5 degrees, and we also know that going beyond 2 degrees will have important consequences. So what we need to do is to, I think, fight every day on every 1/10 of a degree, take the action, push for the action that's needed to keep moving the thermometer in the right direction.
Thank you. There was a question back here. I think you wanted a question. Yeah.
Delane McCullough from the International Budget Partnership. It's a little bit related to the accountability question. I think that you're right, having better sources of data that shows when people are meeting in governments or companies are meeting those commitments. It provides a tool for accountability, but there needs to be a structure for accountability. First part of the presentation on all 3 of the main areas, you talked about decades of meetings, international gatherings, conferences, and commitments made and targets set, none of which are met. And there's no accountability for it, except for the poor countries, the poor people. These images of koalas and kangaroos with mittens on because of their burnt That's where the accountability is falling. And I feel like this is an opportunity. There's a lot of attention on all of these issues, and climate at the lead, but these others as well. It seems like this is an opportune time to look at the structures for collective action, including accountability and penalties. So I don't know if you can speak to what's happening there.
Leo, do you want to take that? Leo came to us from the US Treasury, where he was Deputy Assistant Secretary. He now runs our finance program, but you've thought about some of these issues.
I think one of the key things is to, exactly as you said, to create a structure of accountability. So when we hear about a commitment, for example, the bank commitments that Andrew mentioned in his presentation, we want to know not just how many zeros come after the number that you plan to invest in sustainable activities. We want to know how will you measure that? Is there a methodology associated with the target, right? We want to know, is there a timeline associated with achieving that goal? We want to know what kinds of finance are we talking about? Are there definitions attached to the various categories that are discussed here? And we want to know who announced the target. Was it your CEO or was it somebody 3 levels down in the chain? All of those things are crucial to then say, okay, now we begin to understand the nature of your commitment, and now we can track your commitment, and we can then both shine a light on where it's going, and we can hopefully push other actors to put out better commitments. We need to stop what is, I think, a pathology now, which is simply to reward people for making a commitment, and we need to move to a place where we actually ask them to make good quality commitments, and that's, I think, going to be part of the solution if we apply that idea across all the different kinds of targets and goals.
Thank you. Let's see, do you have another one?
Yeah. I have one more. I have a cities question. I'm going to ask Tini Tran, who leads our communications for the cities team. It's a little hard to read. What new collaborations are something to affect real transformation? But the question is, what should cities do to move the needle? So what should cities do as part of this large transformation that we're trying to do? Tini.
Hi, thank you for that, Michael. I think what we need to all realize as we look around and see what national governments are or are not doing, I think we need to understand that cities actually have quite a bit of power, have quite a bit of influence in where we're moving. And in particular, some of the work that we have been doing is actually to help cities understand that they can work in combination with their national governments to push for these changes. I think that people, at this point, I think we realize that the real action at this point is actually happening at the subnational level, with cities, with civil society, with other leaders. I mean, I think that that's what we're all realizing, is that leadership needs to come from many places. And if national governments are not in the right direction, cities can take the lead. So that, I think, would be one thing that we would really emphasize, is that cities can work in combination with their national governments to push for the types of regulations and policies that are needed to move the needle.
Great, thank you. We'll take maybe a maximum of a couple more, if that's all right, unless people want to stay longer.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Juan Carlos Espinosa. I'm a Master of Science candidate in Sustainability Management at Columbia University. And I was part of the group that got kicked out at the COP without even being protesting.
Well done.
I was protesting, but not violently. I got even my accreditation removed violently by one of the UN security officers, which was rude. But I'm not here to complain.
You're welcome here anyway. Yes. We won't throw you out. Well, it depends what your question is.
Thank you very much.
Then we'll decide.
My question has to do with the fact that you mentioned it before. Environmental activists are being threatened all over the world. Even in my country, in Mexico, also it's a very unsafe thing to do. Also, journalism is very unsafe a very unsafe occupation to do in Mexico. So my question is, are you aware of any initiatives to protect civil society when wanting to engage into protesting or wanting to do more activities to speak up about the issues that are concerning youth in general and people overall in countries? Are you aware of any initiatives to do this more safely?
So just so I understand, specific programs that are being set up?
Initiatives or even places to do it safer or ways of doing it safer?
This is a very interesting question. You know, there's so many initiatives. I mean, certainly you saw the, that Time magazine, the second to last one, which is a coalition to protect journalists. But actually, I don't know. Does anybody know an answer to that question?
I think
it's a good question.
Yeah, we do have a governance center here that focuses on the rights issues. You saw our work around the Escazu Agreement, which is related about getting rights, but I'm not familiar with it, but we could probably follow up with you, and the people who are working on that could probably have some answers. Thanks.
Yes, and then.
Hi, I'm Bart Adesh. I'm the North American representative for the Asian Development Bank, which has committed some $80 billion of investment in climate change mitigation and adaptation between 2019 and 2030. My question is, in addressing those three major issues you identified at the outset, dealing with oceans, biodiversity, and climate change, do you see opportunities or approaches to address those issues while at the same time empowering women and promoting gender equality?
Yes, in capital letters. Yeah, for example, the high-level panel on the ocean has a whole sort of work stream on the issue of gender, and so does the Global Commission on Adaptation has a whole work stream on that too. And I think we've learned, your bank has been central to this. I mean, we've learned a huge amount that not only is it the poor that get most affected by environmental damage, actually there's gender issues, huge gender issues associated with this as well. And so very much so, I came out to your annual meeting in Fiji at the invitation of President Nakao in order to meet with and by the way, Cinnamon here used to be a board member of the Asian Development Bank, in order to meet with the Pacific governors, the 14 ministers of finance and economy of the 14. And I must say, I mean, deeply impressive the way they are thinking about the issue of adaptation. Now, I'm not sure how engaged they are on the gender issue, but some certainly are. I mean, on the Adaptation Commission, we have Minister Kayam from Fiji, who seems to be heavily engaged in this issue. So it'd be good to talk about this more. And we really hope with your new president, you are going to redouble your efforts, because it's really great to see the progress you've been making. Shall we take one by? I don't want to keep
maybe
longer.
Maybe a last question, I think, and then we should.
And we'd be happy to have a smaller discussion moving forward, but I do want to honor those that have to leave and feel a bit awkward. Yeah, why don't we take that?
Hi, thank you. This is Peter Fadul from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation's sustainability program. We're a little bit different than the chamber proper in what we do. We focus a little more on the best practice kind of thought leadership within corporate sustainability, specifically with my team. And I just wanted to hone in on the hard to abate sector, because I appreciate what you said about the strides being made there. I'm wondering what you all are observing in terms of where that innovation is coming from, and whether there's enough coming from the industry players itself, the cement manufacturers, the steel manufacturers, or if it relies on third-party organizations like yourselves or other solutions providers that can help them.
Thank you very much. I wonder whether Jennifer Lakey, who's our Global Director for Energy, would like to take that.
Yeah. Thank you for the question, and we're glad you're here. The hard-to-abate sectors, cement, steel, and others, are looking much more in a patchwork way right now around the world. You have global leadership in certain instances with single companies stepping forward and trying to build the momentum within those sectors, but there is not right now, I think, enough concerted focus within these industry associations and across companies to look at scaling solutions that would be constructive in the time frame required, right? We do know, and we work with renewable procurement with companies around the world, there is a lot of low-hanging fruit that is not being captured, and that's the easy stuff. So when you get all the way to how do you do high-temperature heat, that is a really big problem and a big challenge. We're not even at the beginning part of how do you make sure the electricity you consume today is clean. So I think the question of how do you change a sector is something that we could use your assistance with, and how to begin to build that kind of industry-wide collaboration for change. We still have a long way to go.
Thank you very much indeed. It would be good to follow up with you on that, because it's a very exciting time. Recently, we're part of a group called the CEO Climate Dialogue, which is a group of CEOs, 4 NGO CEOs, and then 10 or 15 corporates. And we went recently to meet with some senators with a group of 4 CEOs, one of which was the CEO of Holcim Lafarge, the biggest European cement, and the whole point was to discuss with senators why we need a price on carbon. And we also had the president of Dow Chemical was with us too. And it was fascinating to see these senators saying, I understand why, a guy like Steer, who's with WRI, is advocating, but why would the biggest cement? And she was saying that actually this, we actually see a lot of prospects for green cement, for example, and we see competitive advantages, but we want a level playing field, so to speak. So it'd be really great. And, there's no reason why the US Chamber can't, get with the program on this. Good. And I know you are with the program, so it's no criticism of you. So while I'm on thin ice, let me end. I would just like to thank all of you for not only coming today, but actually more the partnership that we have with you. And as I said at the very beginning, this is not a time for anything that is solo. These are huge issues. This was a much harder Stories to Watch to put together than normal, because you basically need all the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle to come together, given how urgent the situation. Nobody, whether you're a major government, whether you're a major corporation, nobody can do that together. So thank you. Really, we are up for some pretty disruptive stuff within our own organization in order to go the extra mile. So if you ever have any suggestions for us, please say so. So thank you. Michael, tell us what we need to do next.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming. I do, as Andrew said a couple times, this is a harder deck. Some of us were up very late last night or even early this morning. I want to just thank everybody for coming. I want to acknowledge the folks who really did the heavy lift. Corey, Delger.
Could you guys stand up, please?
Mancy,
for those that actually.
Fiona.
Thank you.
Bill Dugan, who's taking pictures. Roman somewhere, so thank you all. And I want to thank Andrew, who somehow digests, all these slides. We were a little wondering, is this going to be a good presentation this year? I don't know yet. We'll hear more, but I think the fact that we had such a rich conversation, we know we have a big year ahead. Thank you for joining us.
Right.
Thank you all.
Thank you all very much.